Being an educator is one heck of a lonely journey, but every step holds a story, an experience that shapes how we teach, learn, and grow. Welcome to the Educator Experience. I'm your host, Sally Carter, and together we'll explore the moments that define us as educators. Through authentic conversations and shared experiences, we're building a community that connects, reflects, and inspires, all while breaking down barriers in education, one story at a time. You are not alone. Let's grow together. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Educator Experience podcast. Today, we're exploring uncovering unconscious bias in our teaching practice. I'm your host, Sally Carter, and joining me is Chantale Hutchinson. Chantale works in the Teaching and Learning Innovations Department at Okanagan College in Kelowna, British Columbia, as an Education Technology Coordinator, which is a dream position where she gets to play with up-and-coming technologies and collaborate with educators to bring their ideas to life. Pretty cool stuff. Nothing gets her more excited than finding winning solutions to help faculty engage and inspire their students. And Chantale, I have to actually tell you that it's the type of work that you do in teaching and learning innovations that actually inspired the creation of Educator Experience. My original thought was, what if we could support educator development on an even bigger scale by creating an inclusive community of educators really from around the world and provide connection, collaboration, and support. So it's pretty cool. I really appreciate everything you do in your department. So our topic today is really an interesting one, and I think we don't talk about it as much as we could be or we should be as educators, and that's unconscious bias. So Chantale, to get us started, would you be open to explaining what it is and then your experience around it?
Sure. Thank you, Sally, and thank you for the nod. That's wonderful to think that somehow we had a small part in inspiring the work that you're doing because it's so valuable.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I can speak to unconscious bias. I'm going to speak to it from my own perspective as an educator and as someone who supports educators. Looking at the ways that we are making decisions and determinations on our students, on how things are going in our classes, on that class composition, on the decisions we're making as educators, those perceptions and judgments that are happening without our explicit awareness, really, that's happening without us having intention necessarily, and without us necessarily knowing that it's happening in the moment. When we're teaching, as we all know, there's a lot going on, and we're taking in a lot of information, and we're responding to a lot in those environments. And without realizing it, we just have inherent responses to situations, and we are making judgments all of the time. And that's just how our brains work, right? And we look for patterns and we make connections, and sometimes those serve us really, really well, and sometimes they don't. And so the experience that I wanted to share today is one of those times where, as an educator, I came to realize that there were some of those unconscious biases creeping into my practice that I needed to check. And certainly coming to that awareness was really valuable for me. So I've been teaching for a long time. I've been teaching for around 20 years now, and in face-to-face environments as well as online. But I hadn't actually taught the students that I had taught previously in an online environment, which is kind of funny. So I made a pivot into the role that I'm presently in over COVID. And so I was working a lot with other educators during that time online, and spent a great deal of time supporting people in online learning in that capacity. But I hadn't taught the college students that I'd taught previously during that time. So I'd only really dabbled a little bit in online teaching, ironically, before COVID started. So recently I had the opportunity to take over a class for a colleague. And so the class had already begun. It was an online synchronous class, meaning that I met with students all at the same time at a scheduled time online over Zoom. And so it was an interesting circumstance to begin with because I was jumping in the middle of a class community that had already been established. And so obviously that's challenging for any educator, right?
It is. I've done that before. It's
Mhm.
tricky.
It is very tricky.
Mhm.
So from my perspective, I wanted to maintain as much consistency for the learners as I could, because obviously I know that it can be very disruptive. And the educator that I was stepping in for was just incredible and had such a beautifully designed class and had already fostered such a wonderful community with these learners that that was a great place for me to step into. Being online, you want to provide choice just like you do in the regular classroom. And so, to support learners, it had been established that students had a lot of choice for leaving cameras on, having microphones on or off. And there were, as I said, set times for the class to begin and to close. But otherwise, there was some flexibility built in terms of the learner engagement and what that looked like in the class. Well, I started teaching, and I probably had about a quarter of the students who would turn their cameras on and turn their microphones on. And I would join the class a little bit early every time so that we had some conversation. And that was really wonderful. And I got to know them a little bit better. But I would say, particularly with those individuals who had their cameras on and had their microphones on. And so we would have these great conversations. Now, within the room at that same time, there were names on screens, but they were black screens and there were no microphones on. Right? And so over time, it was really great for me to see that more and more people started to speak, started to turn their cameras on, and that would be encouraged as often as I could, but it certainly wasn't mandated in any way. But there were still, even when the class was rolling and I'd been there a few weeks, there were still a lot of students that I really felt disconnected from.
Mhm.
And I hadn't had a chance to have a conversation with them. I hadn't really heard them contributing in class. And so I stepped away and I, reflected on what was going on. And I didn't feel great about not knowing where those students were at in terms of their understanding of course material, in terms of how they were feeling about how the class was progressing and my teaching in general, too, because I was a new instructor to them. And so I continued to try some strategies. I had students go into breakout groups, and that was helpful. I had students share private chat messages to answer questions. So just directly replying to me, not to one
Mhm.
another, so that I could take a pulse and get some formative assessment going a little bit so that I could understand how they were doing. And those strategies were working, and I was getting pretty consistent engagement. I also was really impressed with student attendance. I had students showing up. The same students were coming to class every
Yeah.
time.
They're just
As
you can't see them.
I just couldn't see them and I didn't really know where they were at. And so, as time went on, like I said, some things were working and I felt like I was getting a better sense and taking the pulse, but I still did not feel totally connected with all the learners in that class. And unfortunately, and this is where the unconscious bias comes in, and I'll make myself vulnerable a little bit here and admit I was making some judgments about the level of engagement of those learners without necessarily realizing it. And I didn't really realize this until later, in that I was making an assumption that the students whose cameras were off and who were not jumping onto the microphone, particularly in breakout groups or just in discussion in general, were not as engaged or invested in the course.
Mhm. And I think that's a pretty fair um, judgment or assessment according to other educators as well.
So again, in the moment, I would propose that I didn't really realize this. And so this
Mhm.
is where this came to light. And I think this is where it has value in sharing with other educators, because it wasn't necessarily something that I came to and could articulate in the moment. But when I tried some other strategies, because it was unsettling to me, and I've taught a long time, you start to really follow your kind of spidey senses, right? Like
Mhm.
something's just not sitting right with me. We had a big project that was about to begin. I knew that I really needed to connect with those students that I hadn't spoken with. I did not know how they were feeling in the course because some other students who I had had the opportunity to meet with and chat with had expressed some trepidation about a research project that they were being asked to do. And so I could not help but feel that others were probably feeling the same way. And so I was trying to speak to that to the group. I was inviting students to attend office hours and reach out to me. Uh, but again, that uptake just wasn't happening. So I knew there was a disconnect still. So what I opted to do, and I believe that this worked quite well for me, and I mean everyone's different, but this I would say that this was a success in this case, was that I had the students working in two large groups on a project together in the breakout rooms on Zoom. And then I set up a third room. And I told the students during that class that I would be pulling them into that private room to have a chat with me, every single student. So it
Mhm.
was to touch base, it was to see how they were doing. They weren't going to be quizzed or anything like that. This was just meant to be a check in and an opportunity to have a little chat and talk about how things were starting with this project that they were going to be working on. In that moment, I got to speak with every single student for the first time. And learning, always learning. I would definitely do this far earlier in the term. That would have been very, very beneficial if I had done that at the beginning. So I had these brief check ins with all of the students, and I really got a sense of how they were doing, what they were looking into for their projects. We were able to arrange follow up meetings. I left that feeling so much better about where the students were at and how they were doing. And then after that, after those meetings that we had had, and then for the remainder of the course, the level of engagement and participation was far greater. And I felt that students felt comfortable reaching out to me to ask for help with their projects. And I also, in those moments or in the subsequent meetings that we had, got to know what the students were up against, got to know about the realities of their situations and perhaps why they were not turning their cameras on. So this is where the unconscious bias really comes into light, is that there were a range of different circumstances that students were in that fully made sense that they
Mhm.
would not turn on their microphones or turn on their cameras. And I was not obviously privy to that information. And it wasn't until we, fostered some relationship and some dialogue about where they were at and their learning and they felt comfortable sharing with me a little bit, that I got a better sense of the dynamics in my class and the students that were there. And the other thing that I can share is that that entire class of learners, every single one of them wanted to do well, was invested in that course, and I really think they just needed to feel supported and needed to get to know me a little bit better.
Mhm.
Uh, and so I'm so grateful that we were able to kind of turn things around. But also, when I found myself reflecting on the experience, I was humbled significantly after teaching for so long, right? I thought that I'll admit, I thought that I would do better. And I feel badly that I was kind of making these judgment calls on students' levels of engagement because of their lack of participation. And I think it's a really good reminder when we think about introverted students, when we think about students who may have um, language barriers or other challenges, uh,
Mhm.
that they engage in different ways. Everybody engages in different ways, right? So,
I yeah, I remember I had a student um who was doing really well in class, but let me know that she had to have her camera off because she was joining from work usually. So she'd have me in her ear at the time. She was doing her best to make everything work in her life. It was amazing. But had we not had that conversation, I wouldn't have known.
exactly. That's
Yeah.
exactly it. And I think as we move into a world where there's greater flexibility, which is interesting, again, seeing where I work and what I do, right? Another good reminder, flexible delivery is becoming increasingly an option for students, and as it should be. It's such a valuable thing. when you think about students who have children and work
Mhm.
obligations or other obligations in their life, even the logistics of travel, all of these things, having greater flexibility in terms of how they can learn is really important and it's really valuable. I would have loved this to have these options available years ago. I had students that were bringing their children, their
To
toddlers to
class.
class,
Yeah.
right? Because we wanted to make it work. And kudos to them, but that's obviously not ideal for them. So now we have that flexibility, but as educators, it's a good reminder
Mhm.
that with that flexibility, it looks different and engagement looks different. And the rules of engagement are different, I would propose, right? So I think that it does fall on us to a certain degree to create flexible ways for students to engage and also be able to adapt. If students are able to meet the learning outcomes of that course and demonstrate an understanding, uh, can it look different ways,
Mhm.
right? And having those conversations.
And I think one of the things that stands out from listening to you talk, from the transition from face to face to online, there is, I hesitate to say this, but a greater importance on building rapport individually with
Mm.
students. We don't have the ability to see body language and how people interact in a physical space or a group structure. It's a completely different mindset that's kind of happening here for educators to understand the dynamics. So we, I believe, have to go the extra mile to reach out to people one on one, to have those conversations or figure out how we can get them in a room separately to do check ins and things like that to make sure everything is okay.
I agree. And I think that increasingly, when I think of asynchronous learning in particular as well, right, something that where students are not meeting together with anyone online, the literature shows this too, that class community is really important, especially to mitigate attrition so that students persist. Feeling a part of a class community when you're online is paramount so
Mhm.
that you feel that your ideas are valued, that you're connected to other learners as well as, your professor, instructor, facilitator, that you feel the sense that you're supported and that your ideas matter. We all want that, right? But in online learning, you can feel very detached from your learning. And I think that if we want students to have that deep level of understanding and commitment to what they're learning, that community piece is really integral to that. And that's where you get that meaningful dialogue. That's where you can get that meaningful reflection, right? So for robust learning activities, I think I would propose that you really do need to feel a part of a community. I think we would all
Mhm.
talk about, in our education, when we had people kind of challenge our ideas or jump onto our ideas. All of those facets of learning, I think, are really important, particularly for that critical understanding and reflection. And so fostering that in online environments, I think, is really key. And like you said, so many students are coming from a range of different backgrounds and experiences and abilities. So again, having them feel that they're supported and connected is really key for their success.
As we start to wind down the conversation, I was hoping to ask you what are some questions, because it sounds like in order to test or question our own unconscious biases, um, what questions can we ask ourselves? How would a person take that first step?
Well, it brings me to Stephen Brookfield's work, and I quite like him. He's an adult educator
I've
researcher.
got a bookcase full of his books. He's
Do you?
awesome. Love
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
Yeah.
He's kind of the adult ed rock star a little bit,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. I think he actually is in a band, maybe I heard. Anyways, but so I find what he has to say, it really resonated with me. And when he talks about critical reflection and he talks about the four lenses that you can place on that reflection. So the first one is your autobiographical lens. So really that's the way that we see the world. And that is where we go to, right? So I'm looking, and in my situation, I was looking at this situation and I was making these assumptions based on whatever that may be. I don't really know what I was founding those assumptions on because they were not correct, but I was. And so I was looking at the world through my lens and through my experiences. And that is fine. But what he proposes is to also look at that experience or that incident or your practice through your student's lens as well. So what is, in this circumstance, what was the student experiencing, or how are they seeing the way that I was behaving or the way I was teaching, or the just the approaches that I was using in the class. And then my colleagues' lens. So how would my colleagues perceive this situation? And then the theoretical lens. So looking at the literature, grounding your practice in the literature, is that in alignment with your perceptions, your students' perceptions, your colleagues' perceptions, right? So that you're informing your practice through these different facets that really ideally would create a more holistic approach and a more considered approach. And so when you are finding that you're butting up against something, or maybe, like I was saying, something just was not sitting right with me in those moments, can you put these lenses onto your practice and use them to help you reflect on what you're doing and maybe further guide you, or initiate those conversations with students to get their perceptions, with your colleagues to get their perceptions, or go and be guided by the literature and see what it's saying. Is it consistent with your practice? I think that reflection piece is really key. I think that that's something that we talk a lot, when we're talking particularly to new faculty, like what is your philosophy? Like what kind of grounds your work? And then how do you reflect on those experiences? Because the other thing is, I'm sure you know this too, is that when you're first teaching, it's pretty, it can be pretty traumatic, actually. There's a lot of vulnerability, right? Like when you get called on things by students, or when you misstep. I guess it's that, when you misstep. What do I do when I misstep? Because it's going to happen. It just is. Classes are so dynamic, right? That you can't help but sometimes have that happen. What do you do? How do you respond? What does that look like? And how can something like an approach like this kind of help you not feel so all alone, not feel like you can't get past it, and then just learn from it and have, grow as a result. But
I had last semester? No, in the fall, I taught 2 computer applications classes back to back. So one on a Monday and then one on a Tuesday morning. And then I live in Kamloops, so it's a 2-hour drive. So I had a lot of time in my car to reflect on my Monday class, and any mistakes that I made in that particular class, I just fixed for Tuesday. And it's so rare to have that opportunity to fix something right away through your reflective practice. It was such a cool experience. The art of reflection is pretty impactful.
No, it is. It's really key. And I think it's good modeling for students too, right? Because that's
Absolutely.
ultimately what you're going to want them to bring into their careers too. But no.
Chantale, thank you so much for sharing your experience and your insight around unconscious bias, and how it's an important conversation that I think we each as educators need to be continually having with ourselves and reflecting upon. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. Don't forget to join our Facebook group, Educator Experiences Community, where we connect, collaborate, and support each other on our educator journeys. See you next week.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for joining us on today's episode of the Educator Experience. We hope you're walking away feeling connected, inspired, and just a little bit more supported on your journey. Ready to go a little bit deeper? Join the Educator Experiences community and check out our courses and workshops specifically designed to support new educators as they navigate the ups, downs, and everything in between. You'll find it all at educatorexperiences.com. If today's conversation resonated with you, share it with a fellow educator, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Together, we're building a vibrant community rooted in support and connection. See y'all next Monday.